Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 2nd, 2021. Today I'm going to be talking about Wall Street and the City of London and their policy for the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. And I'm going to take up some of the delusions that people have about what this is and how to deal with it. It's important that these delusions be debunked because they could lead to a false expectation of who actually is fighting this and who is not. So I think it's important that we get clarity on this. The reality is that the US government and the governments of Europe are putting in the hands of Wall Street and the City of London the so-called recovery policy from the effects of the lockdown, the COVID lockdown. Companies like BlackRock and the Morgan banks are the ones that were essentially given access to unlimited credit from the Federal Reserve, which gives more power to the central banks and far less to those banks and financial institutions that fund the local and regional projects that actually produce wealth. In fact, those banks are being cut off from credit, as almost all the credit, all the low interest credit or zero interest credit, is flowing into the biggest banks in the world. And the intent is to give more power to the central banks on behalf of the largest banks through something called the Great Reset, the Davos transformation, and the implementation of the Green New Deal to produce a new green financial bubble to bail out these banks. The too big to fail banks are growing astronomically. So what is a too big to fail bank? The best way to look at this is to look at what Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, did in response to the massive evidence of corruption by major banks and lending institutions that led up to the mortgage bubble that popped in 2008. What Holder said is that the Justice Department will not prosecute these banks because there was a, quote, lack of evidence, unquote. This is a blatant lie. There was incredible evidence of the fraudulent practices of the too big to fail banks. So then he came back with a second excuse. He said the biggest banks have become so large and systemically important that to prosecute them, quote, will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy, unquote. The fact that these banks swindled millions of people out of their homes and were able to pick up those homes virtually for free and then sell them again, that had a much bigger negative effect on the economy. The fact that a new bubble was built afterwards and that these banks were given a green light to continue these practices, that is what had a negative impact. Now, not surprisingly, the Justice Department under Holder, as a result of this series of excuses and rationalizations, deprioritized investigation of mortgage fraud. And what happened to Holder after he left office? He went to work for Covington and Burling, one of the large corporate law firms, which represents, you guessed it, big banks. Now, the four largest banks in the United States, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup, presently have half the deposits in the banking system. Out of $15 trillion in deposits, they hold $7.5 trillion. The seven largest banks control 75%. What are they doing with that money? Well, in some cases, they're sitting on it. In some other cases, they're loaning it to corporations to buy their own stocks so they can stay in business, so they can keep trading worthless financial instruments. Now, at the same time, BlackRock and the big banks have signed an agreement to cut lending to banks that engage in promoting small and medium industry, productive agriculture, based on the so-called decarbonization hoax, the narrative that so-called man-made global warming is caused by carbon dioxide being unleashed into the environment. As we reported yesterday, the scientific community in Italy has called for a scientific debate on this. they have written a paper saying there is no climate emergency and have called on so-called climate scientists to come debate them. So far, not a single one is willing to do so. Instead, they're hiding behind the media protection, with the media saying that people who argue that there's no scientific evidence are climate deniers, equating it with denying the Holocaust. That's how extreme the support is. They won't even allow a discussion to take place. Now, in the meantime, people like Sir Michael Bloomberg are putting huge amounts of money to get rid of coal, electricity produced by coal, natural gas, and oil. Bloomberg gave $500 million to something called Beyond Coal. And now we're seeing coal-fired plants being shut down all over the United States. They're working together with something called the Finance Working Group, which is a product of the Davos billionaires. That's put at in charge of shutting down fossil fuel production and investment in fossil fuel industries. And the decarbonization of industry and agriculture has gone so far that they've got a project to shut down steel production. Now, this is all being done to do what? To protect the bubble, the financial bubble that dominates the world today, and that's part of the so-called rules-based order. Now, whatever happened to the calls for Glass Steagall? This was something that the LaRouche organization has fought for years, to go back to the pre-1999 banking regulation, and actually go back further to the banking regulation from the 1933 up until probably the mid-80s, in which we had very, very few problems with banks. We had a separation between investment banking and commercial banking. Commercial banks were not allowed to engage in speculative investments, but that was torn down over years in part by action of people such as Paul Volcker, people like Walt Wriston of Citibank, Robert Rubin of Citibank, Alan Greenspan, who argued, as neoliberals always do, that government regulation is the cause of an economic problem. No, government regulation prevented economic problems by stopping speculators from going crazy with the expectation that they'll be bailed out if they fail. That's what too big to fail means. You can go into risky speculation, make super profits, and when it blows up in your face, don't worry, the Federal Reserve has your back and will bail you out, even if it means 5 to 7 million families lose homes, industry is shut down, and hospitals and other kinds of infrastructure projects are ended. So that's what Glass Steagall would do, stop that. And in 2016, both parties had Glass Steagall restoration in their platforms. In the Republican platform, it was put there by Paul Manafort, and we know what happened to him. Donald Trump explicitly endorsed Glass Steagall in the campaign and then was resoundingly silent about it after his election. Trump now refers to the CEOs and their huge profits they're making of the big banks as Wall Street geniuses. I hope he's being sarcastic. But meanwhile, he handed to Steve Mnuchin, who was one of the swindlers when it came to taking over foreclosed mortgages. Mnuchin handed to BlackRock and the other large banks, but especially BlackRock, to be in charge of the COVID relief plan. So, and here's what they did. They put out the rumor to Trump supporters that this was a de facto nationalization of the Federal Reserve. Well, is that what's happened? Many of you argued against me when I said this is a fraud. But has the Fed been nationalized? No, the Fed has more power than ever. And its power is to funnel money into these speculative banks and steal it through hyperinflation from working people and middle class in the United States. This is the financial regime change which is underway. There's a hyperinflation. Now, who opposes this? Well, out front is the LaRouche organization, fighting for Glass Steagall restoration still. And on June 26th and 27th, the Schiller Institute will be sponsoring a conference where one of the panels will take up the necessity for going back to Glass Steagall. Globally, worldwide, who opposes the swindle? Sovereign nations that won't give up their sovereignty to the central banks. And who are those sovereign nations? Well, most prominently, Russia and China. Russia and China are targeted for regime change in large part because they're defending their sovereign rights to not be engaged in swindles by the central banks. In fact, the Chinese central bank is cracking down on speculators once again, as they did in 2008, when Eric Holder not only gave them a get-out-of-jail-free card, but with the Obama team gave them huge bundles of new money to set up new swindles, new Ponzi schemes. So I think it's crucial that if you're being pulled into the anti-Russia, anti-China line, recognize that you're being manipulated against the idea of sovereignty, which most Trump supporters say they believe in. But if you support the idea of sovereignty, national sovereignty, you can't go along with the policies of the Davos crowd and the Great Reset, which are targeting Russia and China precisely because they reject the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. That's what I mean when I say we have to take up these delusions that people still have. It's not that I'm saying you have to love Russia and China. I'm saying you have to be serious about who's the real enemy of the United States. The people who are attacking the idea of sovereignty are doing so to defend speculation, deindustrialization, scientific frauds such as the Green New Deal. And they're the same people launching regular attacks on Russia and China, as well as a number of other countries, because those countries don't go along with the so-called rules-based order, whose rules are drafted by the City of London and Wall Street Ponzi scheme operators. So that's my update for today. Go to the LaRouche Organization website to get more, or to LaRouchePub.com, the Executive Intelligence Review, to get more on LaRouche's 4 laws, and I'll see you again tomorrow.